Hi, I'm Cynthia Nichols, the Regional Public Engagement Specialist for the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv. Thanks for joining us today on Views from Ukraine. In today's conversation, our experts are discussing Ukrainian identity. After 45 minutes, our panelists will go into private breakout rooms to answer questions from the media in attendance. As a reminder, the panel is being recorded, but the breakout rooms are not.
Recording in progress.
All conversations are on the record. If you are in our main Zoom session, please remember to mute your microphones and turn off your cameras. And now I'll hand it over to our moderator, Press Attaché for the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, Dan Langenkamp. Dan?
Thank you, Cynthia. With more than 100,000 troops poised on Ukraine's border, the world's attention is turned to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. Ukraine, a country that just in 2021 celebrated its 30th year of independence. Who are the Ukrainian people? What makes them unique? And how has Russian aggression now and over the course of history shaped their identities? Today, we have three experts. Nataliya Gumenyuk, a Ukrainian author and journalist who is CEO and co-founder of the Public Interest Journalism Lab. We have Andrei Bachenko, who has been director of the Sociological Service of the Razumkov Center in Kyiv since January 2000. And we have Anton Hrushetsky, the deputy director of the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology. Without further ado, we'll get straight to our discussion with our experts. Thank you for joining us, Anton, Nataliya, and Andrei. Let's start with a very, very basic question. First of all, what is Ukrainian identity? Anton, how about you?
First of all, it's not a very simple question. It's very complicated. And from the sociological point of view, I could say that, and from the point of view of current situation, it's first of all, we need to understand how Ukrainians perceive themselves in the context of Russia. What the relationship should be with Russia. And if 15 years ago we had 20% of respondents thinking Ukraine should join with Russia into one state, now we have 5% response. Follow the whole Ukraine history since 1990s, the absolute majority of Ukrainians think that Ukraine and Russia should be independent countries since 2014. Even more Ukrainians support this idea. And what is more important, since 2014, much less Ukrainians think Russia is a good state and have good attitudes towards Russia, and much more Ukrainians think that Ukraine is a part of Europe and Ukraine should join European Union and NATO.
Can you go back and say that one more time? We cut out a little bit, and I didn't hear the statistics that you gave about the opinion of Ukrainians towards Russia over the course of the last several years. Can you say that one more time?
While before 2014, 80–90% of Ukrainians had good attitudes towards Russia, now we have only 40% of Ukrainians having good attitudes towards Russia. So we have a drop more than 2 times. And what is more, those who have good attitudes towards Russia, they have good attitudes only because they understand Russia as Russian ordinary people, with only 10–15% having good attitudes towards the Russian authorities. At the same time, most of Ukrainians think that Ukraine should join European Union and should join NATO. So, and over the last years, there was a huge increase. So for this moment, the majority of Ukrainians support this European integration of Ukraine.
Okay, now, so it has that sort of favorability rating of Russia decreased even more after 2014, or what happened exactly at that time? Andrei, maybe you can help us out with that question.
Yes, I think that in 2014 we had just dramatical changes in not exactly in Ukrainian identity. Identity in general changed not so much, but some aspects changed very significantly. One of the things that most of Ukrainians, I mean citizens of Ukraine, now don't think that Russia is friend and don't think about themselves as part of Russian world. Another just great breakout was that changed dramatically attitude to NATO. If before 2014, even pro-Ukrainian and pro-European Ukrainians, a lot of them were against joining NATO. And from Soviet time up to 2014, NATO was in imagination of majority of Ukrainians kind of a monster. In 2014, we change, I mean, Ukrainians change their opinion, and now majority of Ukrainians are willing to join Ukraine to join NATO. And so identity in general changed not very much, but we just reversed, let's say, a scale of friends and enemies. So because we know now Ukrainians can see enemies, not imaginary enemies, but real soldiers with real weapon, and we can, I mean Ukrainian. When I say we, I mean Ukrainians. Most of Ukrainians can see who are friends. So I think this is the main changes. And about NATO, it was greatest stereotype that before 2014 that NATO is kind of enemy, just evil and so on, and now it's broken. I mean the stereotype.
I see. So you're seeing basically a general increase in the favorability of NATO and I guess European Union integration, and you're seeing a decline in the Russian favorability rating. But let me ask you, Nataliya, is this really only about is Ukrainian identity dependent solely upon, the image of Russia and Russia's actions? I mean, there's a lot more to the Ukrainian people. Could you comment on that?
Exactly, because identity could be tricky. We know how identity politics is used very much, including in the fueling conflict and by the Kremlin itself. So I'm a journalist myself, but our organization does also research on media consumption and the way how the content on history is developing. So basing on those findings, we can say that indeed, Ukraine, we managed to confirm that Ukrainians have a strong feeling of the civic identity. So it's not really that much about ethnicity or language. And despite everything, because it's usually that the Kremlin and even sometimes the foreign media try to divide Ukraine into, Western or Eastern, Russian-speaking or Ukrainian-speaking, that often doesn't mean that people have some particular views. What we understand that Ukrainians are normally, divided across this usual modern divide when the people in the villages could be more authoritarian, prone to authoritarianism, and the city dwellers, younger people, are more liberal, are more open-minded, and less prone to, doesn't matter where they are. So when we also speak, of course, we can't avoid this point of Russia, but I also need to say that when in one of our research, there were many, we asked people how would they define what makes them different from Russia. They would first of all speak about freedom as the core, as one of the core values. And this idea that Ukrainians are free-loving people, that they are more individualistic, that makes probably the biggest distinction in a different, let's kind of, when we look at that through the other lenses. So I still would go that, of course, Ukrainians are, they trust the state less, and the Russia, there was never here the, support for the Tsar or, idea that there should be the leader. But in a short introduction, I should say that this, when we're speaking about anti-Russian, for instance, we mean not really this clearly ethnical division. It's really what today, for instance, the Russia symbolizes as a kleptocracy, authoritarian state. And, Ukrainians also could be, let's say, more chaotic, more democratic, but it's really about the values across the country. So even if we speak about the differences, they are built not along the lines of the, of course, there are the generational change. A lot of people grew up in the Soviet Union, so there is a difference between young and older generation. However, still, if you're speaking about the majority, we can today speak about quite a multicultural, civic country, where there is a tolerance to different nations and attitudes. And by which people consider they are different from Russians.
Of course, there's a big historical element to Ukraine's identity as well, don't you think? I mean, when we talk about the role of Ukraine in World War II, when we talk about the role of Ukraine in Tsarist Russia, when we talk about the role of Ukraine during the Soviet era under Stalin, for example, we think of things like the Holodomor and other actions and other things that have happened here. Could you comment on that? I mean, how does history play into Ukrainian identity, going way back before 2014? And I'll just open this up to anybody on the panel.
Let me maybe a bit go on, because it would also explain a lot. There are, of course, along the history where, I mean, to cut it short, yes, it's true that, the Kiev Rus started in Kiev, and Russia as it is was created way later. But I'm not going to speak about that long.
Yeah.
But I just
you
want
could
to say
touch on Kiev and Rus and what the relationship between Kiev and Rus and Moscow is for those listeners who don't know that history.
Okay. I'll try to make it very brief, these centuries of history, but indeed, the Kiev Rus, let's say the cradle of the countries which today considered Belarus, Russia, was in Kiev. There were different kingdoms. I would skip a lot of parts of the history. Later, years later, centuries later, Russia has been created. And still the kingdom comes from Kiev. Then there was a very chaotic Middle Ages, but there was a moment in Ukraine, because it's a borderland. Of course, there was unfortunate history when some part of the Ukrainian territory at different times belonged to different kingdoms, from Poland to various else. But what really played a huge role in the moment when we speak about the modern identity, in the 19th century, it's true that part of the Ukraine had been the part of the Tsarist Empire. And during the Russian Empire, languages were, the people speaking Ukrainians were persecuted. All this all the usual things. Also, not to trying to make it too complicated. It's interesting that during the Soviet Union couldn't be created without both Ukraine and Russia, and and Belarus. No, but I'm particularly speaking about Ukraine as a very important, like by amount of the people, by the Ukrainian leadership and the people who are there. So that makes for Ukrainians very difficult today to understand their relation to the Soviet Union, because, for instance, in our relations with Germany, which is make it even more complicated for Germany, not for Ukraine, the biggest battles, they were taking place in the territory of the Ukraine. The main battlefield was in the Ukraine. It was the Ukrainian soldiers, the Ukrainian front, which was really fighting Hitler. But in
World
the
War II,
end,
yes. Okay.
yeah, during the World War II, and but somehow, because it was just the Soviet Union, now we feel that in relations between Germany and Russia, that there is a feeling of guilt towards Russia, not towards Ukrainians. So really, that's how complicated it is. But at the same time, because Ukrainians was always a bit a rebellion nation, and it was very important to pacify Ukraine for Stalin. There was a Holodomor, the artificial famine, which killed more than 4 million Ukrainians, and what was by Stalin in 1932, 1933, which is the biggest national trauma in the Ukrainian history. So, there were so many events of this way that, of course, for some part of the Ukrainians, Russia still is this empire. It bears this responsibility. It was a bit better in the 90s, when there was at least a hope of democracy in Russia. But with the regime of Vladimir Putin, who wants to revoke the Soviet Union, more and more Ukrainians started to treat Russia as exactly, this prolongation of the Stalin empire, of the Tsarist regime, and which is responsible for, what we know, for the gulags, for all the atrocities of the 20th century. So that is a part of the very important. At the same time, of course, we know that there were rather, let's say, calmer and peaceful years in 80s and 70s. So there is a part of the generation in Ukraine which grew up speaking Russian because it was a colonist language, which, has by geography been very close. So the relations are close, but my colleague sociologist pointed very right. The Ukrainians have very different relations to the Russians as a population and to the Russian state. And I think that's why it's also very important, because the risk is, and while Russia put a lot of energy to portray Ukraine as a nationalistic state, to totally, undermine this idea of civil identity, that's why we also should be very careful how we define this, let's say, anti-Russian sentiment in Ukraine, that for a lot of people it's anti-authoritarianism, anti the former empire, anti what the Soviet Union did wrong.
With Ukrainians, I often get into discussions about language and about how language influences identity and culture. And in Ukraine, it's incredibly complicated because you have patriotic Ukrainians that are native Russian speakers. Andrei, I wonder if you can tell us, break down the Ukrainian nation for us in terms of language, and can you tell us about how the different groups identify themselves? I mean, can you simply divide Ukraine between the Russian speakers and the Ukrainian speakers and make general categorizations about them, or not?
I would say that language situation is much more complicated because of this inheritance of Soviet Empire, Russian Empire. Often people, even who speak Ukrainian, usually speak Ukrainian, is in close circle. Two persons who usually speak Ukrainians, but they don't know each other. On the first meeting, very often, they speak Russian, because it's kind of, I don't know, habit from Soviet Union. That is why it's complicated situation. Now we can see now that younger people much more frequently speak Ukrainian language than older people. And there is some difference between Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers, but after 2014, in terms of Ukrainian identity, it's not a main, I think, reason, not a main indicator that you can think about person as person with Ukrainian identity or not Ukrainian identity. But language issue has another dimension. I think that very big influence on Ukrainian identity and on Ukraine has the fact that unfortunately for most Ukrainians and pro-Ukrainian and pro-European Ukrainians as well, they can see a picture of the world by Russian means, because Ukraine itself have not so much informational services to give information to people about events in the world. And most of Ukraine don't know other languages, I mean major languages, where you can find a lot of information, international information. And most of Ukrainians, including agencies, they receive information from Russian sources because of language. They are formed by Russian literature, Russian cinemas, and so on. And I think it's much more crucial aspect of language issue than just which language person speak, because we have, I can say that from 1990, more and more people speak Ukrainian, and it's a natural process because younger people much more frequently speak Ukrainian. But still, majority of Ukrainians can see the world by Russian eyes and can hear the world by Russian ears. That is why it's, I think, much bigger problem.
And of course, in Eastern Ukraine, you find more Russian speakers. In Western Ukraine, you tend to find more Ukrainian speakers. But Anton, I wanted to ask you, is that changing? Where you find more and more Ukrainian speakers everywhere, and B is, do you think that this is the larger question, could you say that there's a crisis of Ukrainian identity because you've got these two different sides of the country, or is Ukraine more unified than that?
In our opinion, and from our sources, we could see that you're right that the southern and eastern regions are predominantly Russian-speaking regions. But as it was mentioned before, in Ukraine, language doesn't play a significant role in national identification, because Russian-speaking Ukrainians could be slightly more have more pro-Russian views, but in general, they also support European integration, I think that Russia is an aggressive state, that there is a war between Ukraine and Russia, and surely they support Ukraine. So it's a very artificial line of division of Ukrainians imposed mainly by Russian propaganda and by Russia, saying that if a person is Russian speaking, then this person is a part of Russian world, and that is why we should protect this person. As you can see in Kyiv, it's a very interesting case, because now the majority of Kyiv residents are Russian speaking, but at the same time they support the status of Ukrainian language as the only one state and official. They support Ukraine joining the European Union, NATO, and also they fight in the eastern Ukraine. So in this case, being a Russian speaking Kyiv resident in no way means you have a pro-Russian views. As for the dynamic situation in eastern and southern Ukraine, there's a growing number of Ukrainian speakers, but still they still predominantly Russian-speaking regions because of this long history of imposing Russian language on these territories. And what is more important, I wanted to add to Nataliya's words, we trace the attitudes towards different ethnic groups and linguistic groups in Ukraine since 1990s. And the most tolerated groups in Ukraine are Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians. So typical Ukrainian, even Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainian, has a very good attitude towards ordinary ethnic Russians in Ukraine or Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Moreover, 75% of Ukrainians have a good attitudes towards ordinary Russians living in a Russian state. So again, it's not an ethnic conflict, and Ukraine is not a nationalistic state, and Ukraine has more civic identity. It just wants to live better and with a better countries like not because Russians are better from views of Ukrainians. No, Ukrainians have good attitudes towards Russia, but just they want to live an independent, its own state.
There is some couple of things to add on what my colleague said. To explaining the complexity, I kind of often give this example. My sister is 5 years elder. When she grew up in the school, there was no Ukrainian school in our district, so she still now speaks to my family in Ukrainian. I grew up a bit later and went to the school already in Ukraine, so I speak with my family in Ukrainian at the same table, and it doesn't matter.
One person might say something in Russian and the other person might respond in Ukrainian.
Absolutely. And I refer to my sister in Russian and I refer to my mom in Ukrainian at the same evening, like switching all the time, which is the case for a lot of Ukrainians. But to explain to international colleagues who are listening to us, I think it's important to explain this history, also why, some kind of Ukrainization taking place later. Because for centuries, indeed, the Ukrainian language was discriminated to different extent at different points of history. And we went to this situation where for the people in the cities were more speaking Russian, because Russian has become kind of the language of the empire, of the metropolis, while Ukrainians also was kind of considered as this village language. And so there was a contempt, like a systematic contempt to the Ukrainian language for decades and decades. So what Ukrainian state needed to do in the end, after the independence, there was some kind of affirmative action when you really need to make the promotion. And I think that now even the debate which we have today about the language and whether this or that policy of the Ukrainian state should be there, and which is sometimes demonized by Russia, which is used in Russian propaganda, is more or less the same argument when we have with the discussion about affirmative action on anything, like if any groups which was for ages discriminated give some preferences, does it discriminate the majority? Now it's not any longer the majority who are speaking Russian. It's again the generational thing. One more thing still to add. It's true that today, after the 8 years of war in Crimea and in the Donbas, Ukrainian language was pushed away. It was not before, but now we know that, it's not in the schools. It was in the schools, by the way, even during the Soviet Union, and people were speaking Ukrainian there. And if I would travel there, I think like speaking Ukrainian would be considered like a dissent, like a political position, which is drastic. But of course, we understand that what happened now and the result, if you have a 14 years old, Crimeans or 12 years old Crimeans or people there or in the Donbas, it's not was the reason for the conflict, it's the result.
That's so interesting. And I wanted to ask you about the statement by President Putin that there is something akin to genocide going on in Ukraine against Russian-speaking people. I mean, this is a really important narrative for President Putin to try to perhaps justify an invasion, or certainly to rally support within Russia for his actions. How do you respond to that? Is it possible to say that there's discrimination against Russian speakers on a systematic scale? How do you react to that? And any of the panelists, please just jump in.
I could say that from the point of view of our surveys, when we ask a question, what are the top problems for your family or for Ukraine, only a few percent says that the status of Russian language or some problems or threats for Russian language is top of problems for Ukraine and for Ukrainians. Even among Russian-speaking Ukrainians, only few percent think that there are some huge problems because of their language. For the majority of population, economy problems, war with Russia, and corruption problems are the top problems, not the Russian language. So the Russian-speaking Ukrainians in general do not feel themselves discriminated. Surely there is some part of such Ukrainians who could agree that they're discriminated, but the majority of Russian-speaking Ukrainians do not feel any discrimination because of language.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, so there is a language law that was passed in Ukraine recently. Now you have to provide services first in the Ukrainian language and then ask for it in Russian. And then language in schools, from what I understand, should be primarily in Ukrainian, but Russian can be offered as a second language. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So let's talk a little bit about Russian aggression a little bit more. Putin has written an article last summer, a 5,000-word article explaining the historical unity between Ukrainians and Russians. I'm sure that our panelists have read this. It lays out a case for basically essentially for the non-existence almost of a Ukrainian state. Could any of the panelists comment on that article? Is it, I mean, if you've read it through, do the narratives there, are they things that you recognize, and is it easily debunkable, this article, or is it based in fact?
Andriy.
Sorry, go ahead, Andriy.
I read this article more. We, Razumkov Center asked Ukrainians. We did a small survey about this. And I can say that I'm not a historian, but I'm sure that it's absolutely lying position of Putin. But we ask Ukrainians if they agree with the statement of Putin. And 12.5% agree, citizens of Ukraine agree that Ukrainians and Russian are the same people and they cannot be separated and so on. 70.5% disagree, and other people couldn't answer. But I should say that in all dimensions, in regional dimensions, including southern and eastern oblast of Ukraine, in age dimensions, including the oldest people, ethnical Russians and ethnical Ukrainians, Russian-speaking Ukrainians and Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians, in all groups, a majority disagree with this statement of Putin. So we can see that Putin, don't want to think about Ukrainians as a separate nation, but this nation, even ethnical Russian and Russian-speaking Ukrainians, even them, most of them, majority, think about Ukrainians as a separate nation. So Ukrainians and Russians are separate nations. So it's not only my opinion.
Of course, to assert that they're not separate nations is fundamentally, a violation of the concept of state sovereignty and the very independence that Ukraine has created in the last 30 years. Let's turn away from this question and move towards ethnic minorities in Ukraine. Nataliya, maybe you could tell us about the different ethnic groups and the sort of panoply of different people that live in Ukraine. Could we just touch on this for our audience before we move into the breakout rooms in a few minutes?
So it's true that Ukraine is multicultural, but the point was that we have, Ukrainians, Russians, Belarus people, Poles, Hungarians, because of the kind of how the terrain Ukrainian is, its borders with a lot of countries. It's also important to understand that during the Soviet time, there was a policy of the assimilation. So even people are ethnically belong to any group, they didn't really, they didn't have this tradition to exercise their right to their language or to their, religion or so. So, even having, for instance, Jews in Ukraine, they probably won't be very much practicing Jews, as we understand in the American way. So that's something to understand. But when you really talk to people, you just really know that on the practical level, in your team, in your company, you would have somebody with these roots or with that, with Russian or Belarusian or Georgian or something. But I want to point out exactly for that's why leading. In particular, also, we do have the Crimean Tatar. It's not minority; it's an indigenous population which has no any other motherland than the Crimean peninsula. The people had been, there were a number of the historical wars where they were pushed out of Crimea also by Russia. But the most famous case was that after 1944, the Crimean Tatars as a whole nation, till the last person, they were deported to Central Asia. A huge part of them died during this trip. It was happening within one day during the Second World War. They were not allowed to come back to Crimea till 1989, till the end of the Soviet Union. And for them, for instance, they have this tolerance towards Ukraine and support because they are, of course, the Soviet Union as an empire risked the existence of the whole nation. But it's a Muslim minority, and by the way, also, which is today portrayed by Russia as, like in Russia, we have the problem of the religious fundamentalism in the Caucasus. So Russia today wants to put this stereotype into the Crimea. However, Crimean Tatars, it's a very also quite a civil nation. It's not orthodox. But I think also what we understand from the surveys, that was largely unknown for a lot of Ukrainians prior to this war. But we also see this openness. But again, for me, it's important to mention that this is also the part of the Ukrainian state and accepting, which is very, very, very distinct for this state.
I think that Russian actions then are, just to sort of wrap up this part of the conversation, it seems to me, and it seems to, I think, a lot of observers, that Russia is trying to sort of reestablish hegemony over Ukraine and this part of the world, but all of its actions are aggressive and seem to be doing exactly the opposite of what it says it wants to do. If Putin thinks that there's a historical unity between Ukraine and Russia, invading the country like it did in the Donbas and annexing Crimea and putting troops on the border seem to do the opposite. I just wonder if the panelists could comment on that. Anton, we haven't heard from you in a little while. How about what do you
You're
think?
totally right that in this case, soft power will be much more effective because till 2014, Ukraine have roughly 50% of relatively pro-Russian voters, residents, 50% of relatively pro-Western voters. When discussing all this issue about Russia, they had some grounds because at that time, 80–90% of Ukrainians had good attitudes towards Russia, even good attitudes towards Putin. They saw Russia and wanted Ukraine to be also like Russia with the stability, high salaries, etc. But since 2014, first of all, Ukraine for this moment lost a lot of territories with millions of pro-Russian voters, and which affected all the pro-Russian parties. And secondly, residents on the other territories of Ukraine are now have less pro-Russian views. And on average, they support the European Union joining to NATO, etc. So, and in this case, to persuade them oppositely, that Russia is a friend is too complicated. All these articles on the same people will not persuade the majority of Ukrainians, and especially the younger generation. So for this moment, Russia did the opposite, and Ukraine is much far away from Russia than it was before, even 10 years ago.
Thank you very much for that. And just to wrap up, as an expatriate that lives in Ukraine, I would just like to say that I find Ukrainian people to be incredibly, not only resilient and intelligent and courageous, which we know from history and from the last 8 years, but also just an incredibly friendly and warm people. And I think our panelists today really exemplify these characteristics. So I would like to thank them, Andriy, Anton, and Nataliya, for being here with us today. And this was Views from Ukraine. We'll go to breakout groups now. You should have a box on your screen that tells you how to get there. I'm Dan Langenkamp. I'm the press attaché at US Embassy Kyiv. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, everyone. For everyone who is remaining, the way that the breakout rooms work, you should have a small button on the bottom of your screen that says breakout. All you really have to do is go and drag your mouse to that. There are already 3 breakout rooms that are labeled for our panelists, in which you can select and go to that specific one.